Friends, welcome back to the web technology video learning series. We have learnt HTML quite a bit so far in under the heading of fundamentals of HTML. We have learnt what is HTML, we have seen what are the primary uses of HTML, how the text can be formatted, how to put the tables, how to put links, lists, images and so on and so forth. But if you have noticed so far, most of whatever we have seen is a way of the server giving the information back to the user. There is nothing that the user is telling it so that the server gets some information back. So this is all what technically is called a non-interactive. So server sends the data, and once the data is sent, there is no more connection that is required with the server. Server doesn't care about what the user is doing with the data that is displayed, or the text that is displayed, or the information that is displayed. But isn't it that for most of the websites that we see some kind of interactiveness? What do I mean by interactiveness? Interactiveness is a way of user informing something back to the server. Let's say you are doing a Google search. You are informing a search term that is of importance to you back to the server. Server is doing something and then it is getting back the results to you. Let's say you are visiting a website and then there is a feedback form. You fill the feedback form, give your feedback and then click submit. The data goes back to the server. This is all interactivity. Well, some form of interactivity. The main thing here is how do we do the same thing in HTML? Obviously all websites are doing, so it must be possible for us to do as well. But we have not learned about it so far. Well, that's what we are going to learn today. The technique or the part of HTML that deals with this kind of interactivity is called forms. Forms is actually a very vast subject. We try to touch upon the important aspects of it so that if you want further learning, you can go ahead and do something and then enhance your learning further. There are two aspects to the forms. If you have understood the feedback form example, if you remember it, there are two parts of it. One, user submits a feedback form and then server receives it, right? But looking at from a HTML perspective, there is a way the HTML page has to receive the feedback from the user. So there are some what are technically called as controls where user can type the information and there is a button. When you click that button, the information is sent back to the server. So these controls are part of HTML, including the buttons, right? This is all one aspect. The other aspect is how is the server receiving the data that is sent by the browser when the submit button is clicked. So that is the part on the server. The part on the server is quite complicated, quite complex, and then there are many ways of implementing the same. And unfortunately, that does not fall under the purview of our class HTML classes. We will focus on how to build forms that can take user input and then how to send the data back to the server. That is what we will be focusing on in this lesson. Now let's talk about little bit more about forms. Why is it called a form? Are you not already familiar with the term form? Let's say you want to apply for an Aadhaar. What do? You fill the Aadhaar form. Let's say you want to join a college, you fill an application form. Let's say you want to join a session or a big meeting or symposium. What would you do? You will fill a registration form. You want to apply for a PAN card, you fill an application form. So the term form is kind of pretty much known to us. What is the common thing across all these forms that I have mentioned so far? They are all on a paper. They are all meant to take user data. If you notice carefully, they are all very similar. They have labels and text boxes. Text boxes are essentially blank spaces where we fill our data. The labels are those that indicate what needs to be filled. Sometimes there is help, sometimes there is no help, but all the forms are very similar. The application forms or registration forms or even cancellation forms, for example, they are all very similar. The term form is essentially in HTML is essentially coming from the same terminology that we use in the real life. We try to build a form similar to the paper form but in HTML. Now let's look at a representative form. Here is a representative form on the screen. It is trying to take some data from some student, right? It is trying to ask what is your first name, what is your last name, what is your age. Then it is trying to get some more personal details. What is your favorite programming language? And then there are some options here: C, C++, JavaScript, and then if there is something else, then there is an other option. And then there is a question on which vehicle do you own. People can own multiple vehicles, so there are multiple options here. There is a bike, there is a car, there is a cycle, and then there may be other options too. And then there is a question on what is the current salary. And then you can see there is an option for user to select, and there is a default option there as well. We'll talk about what this is in a moment. And then there is a blank space for user to type in any additional feedback that they want to submit back to the server. This is a typical or rather simple HTML form which can easily be put on a paper. It can easily be counted as a paper form, right? Now notice the two buttons in the bottom. There is a submit button, there is a reset button. A submit button will essentially send all the data from the form to the server that the form is supposed to be talking about. And then there is a reset button. This reset button will clear all user entered data in the form elements and then put it back to as if it is coming fresh from the server to the default values, as we say. Okay. Now let's talk about how we look at each of these elements, right? The overall thing is a form that we know. Then there is a label. The labels are those with our plain text, last name, first name, age. All these things are labels. The ones which are blank rectangles are called text boxes. This is a typical terminology. These are text boxes. And there is a special text box that takes numbers as an input. These are called numbered text box. If you notice the display, there is an up arrow and down arrow button. These are what we call as scroll buttons. User can essentially enter a number in this text box, or they can use the up arrow, down arrow to go to the value that they desire. One additional important is you cannot enter a character or any keyboard letter into this text box. Only numbers may be entered. That's why it's a numbering text box. And then there are radio buttons. What are radio buttons? If you see, there is C, C++, JavaScript, and there is other. There are 4 labels, and then you can select only one of them. That is why they are called radio buttons, right? So we cannot select more than one here, and the radio buttons are typically shown in a circular fashion. The one that user selects it has a dot inside the circle. Everything else is plain. These are called radio buttons. The opposite of radio button is called a checkbox. Here there is no grouping, as in you can select any number of checkboxes as we want. all three of them in the example can be selected. These are checkboxes. Now, the one where user is required to select a salary is called a drop down. Why is it called a drop down? Because there is a drop arrow or the button, a drop button towards the end of the selected item. If you click there, more options will be shown which are not shown by default. So it drops down upon user selection, which is why it is called a drop down. Now, the place where running text can be entered is called a text area. It is similar to text box, but you can see it is slightly bigger in size. It is probably having more columns and more rows. You can type lot more text than what is in a text box. And we have a submit button and we have a reset button. These are simple buttons. So this is our normal working terminology. Okay, not that this is HTML. These are our normal functional terms for each of these items on screen. Now, you already know right now so far that for everything and anything that we want to do with HTML, there is a tag, right? If you want to have a paragraph, there is a paragraph tag. If you want to have a heading, there is a heading tag. So if you want to put a heading, what do? We put a heading tag and then put whatever we put text that we want in between the beginning and the ending tag. Then see, we have a heading. Likewise, every one of the items that we have on the left hand side also has a tag in HTML. I think so. Right now I am repeating myself and I did this many times. Whole of learning HTML is essentially about learning more and more tags and more information about each tag. So each of the elements that we have on screen have corresponding HTML tags. Let's look at what are those tags. The form, without any surprise, is rendered with a form tag. It is a paired tag. There is a grouping that is possible within the form. For example, we can say these are personal details, these are education details, and so on and so forth. If you want to do such a grouping, then there is a field set tag. You can combine different fields into a single field set. The labels have a label tag. Then most of the other data where user is giving us an input, the controls or the elements in the form which take the user input. Mind you, I said most, not everything. They are all encoded using input tag. Okay. Then there are different attributes for input that determine what kind of element is rendered on the screen. For now, this is just an input tag. What input tags do we see on the screen? A text box is an input tag. Text box with a number is also with an input tag. Radio buttons, check boxes, and the buttons. These are all done using input tags. Okay. Then the drop down is rendered using a select tag. The text area, no surprises here, is rendered using a text area tag. Now, these are all different tags. These are some of the important tags that we get in HTML. One of the questions that I think we should have is, why is select not an input? Because from a user perspective, that is also taking an input. Likewise for text area. And why is buttons called input? Why it is not anything else? There is no user input here apart from just clicking them. Right? This is one prominent question that we should have when we see this form and map the corresponding elements to tags. The answer is that HTML language has not been done in one shot. It has been an evolving language. So whatever ideas were there at the time of creation of the standard at that particular version has been put in. So right now we are having HTML5, and HTML5 more or less supports everything else that has happened on all the previous versions from HTML1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and 4.01 and now 5. So this is how we ended up with different tags for them. Some of them are pretty straightforward, some of them need a bit of understanding. So that is first question. The second question is as much important as well. We have a label tag. But if you have noticed on the screen, there is nothing that is important that a label is specifying. It is just some running text. We could do this with a paragraph tag. We don't even need any paragraph tag to put something on the screen. We can just put it in the HTML body tag. Then why do we need a label tag? Why do we have to learn about label tag if whatever we want to do with label tag can be achieved without a label tag? It is true, we don't actually need a label tag for displaying a text on HTML, that too inside a form. Then why do we need a label tag? We need label tag because it's a best practice, and because if this form is not being read by the user on a computer screen, instead there is an intelligent assistant that is reading out this form to somebody who is probably busy. So we have an Alexa or Siri or Google Assistant like assistant which is reading an incoming HTML web page and reading out the data to the user. Maybe there is a very busy person, or maybe there is a person who is visually impaired. Now we can see the text and then map that, okay, this text is really a label for the underlying text box. But if people cannot see, then the mapping is gone. Computer cannot understand that this text is actually for the text box. To aid the computer, we put a label tag, and inside the label tag you will see that we mentioned that this label is for a text box. So we make the connection explicitly that this is the label and this label is for this text box. Therefore, any computer or any software that is automatically processing the form and reading out the information to somebody else can easily make that connection. That is why label tag is important. Let's look at the input fields. We saw in the previous slide that most of the fields that are of any use or that are taking input from the user are all input tags, right? On the left hand side, you have these input fields in proper HTML, and on the right hand side, you have the same form. The text box is rendered with an input field on line number 8. The tag name is input. I think that is by now clear. The type attribute has a value of text. That indicates that the user wants a text field here. Then there is a max length which is of value 20 and size which is of value 10. What is the difference? The size indicates how big the text box should be displayed, and max length indicates what is the maximum length of the string that user can type. Okay, some of these attributes are common and used across different input fields, so you should be careful to remember them. And there is an ID and there is a name. Okay, if you have seen in the examples that we have, the ID value almost is the same as the name attribute. The value for the ID attribute and is the same as the value for name attribute for most of them. Why do we need to? Remember, the data from the form is sent back to the server. When it is sent back to the server, it says this text box has this value. Now, how does it identify what text box? It uses the name. So, if ever we fill some name ABC in first name, the browser says f name is equal to ABC and it sends the data back to the server. That is how server knows that the data user has filled is actually for the text box with the name f name. But why is it just the name attribute and not the ID attribute? That is a convention. Whatever is the attribute that is called name is the one that is sent back to the server. The attribute with the name ID is used for looking up the information in the form from within the HTML code, more specifically JavaScript code. We will learn about JavaScript and looking up the element in a DOM tree in a subsequent lesson. For now, it is important that we put both ID and the name attributes in the HTML. Preferably they should be same. Okay, but if you want to use different elements, we should know exactly what we are doing. That is the text box. The next element is a number. The attribute for the type attribute has a number as a value. It indicates it's a numbering or numbered text box. That is the one that is used for the age on the form. So it has a slightly different set of attributes. One is called minimum, the other is called max. Min and max are the values that user will not be allowed to enter or cross the boundaries. The default value is indicated with the value attribute, and default we are saying it should be 20. And the ID and name attributes are something that we already know. Now, line number 16 and 18 are indicating radio buttons, and the value attribute always indicates what is the value of that particular input. Now, everything else you should already be familiar, except that you will find that these two radio buttons have the same name. Why is that the case? This is how we are saying only one of them can be selected. The value that is for the selected element will be assigned to the name attribute and is sent back to the server. Okay, because we put the same value for the name attribute for both the radio buttons, only one of them will be allowed to be selected. When we select the other one, the first one will be deselected automatically. Okay, now 21 and 24 lines on the left hand side, they are telling how we are using checkboxes. So naturally they have different names because more than one can be selected at the same time. There is no grouping here, they are all individual. The submit button and the reset buttons are of the types submit and reset. For the submit button, the value should be submit by default. These are all different input fields that we have on the screen. There is a select option as well. If you notice the form, there is a what is your current salary question, and there is a drop down, right? This drop down we said is implemented using a select tag. On the right hand on the screen you have two examples for using select. One that about the form that we have discussed previously, and another a slightly different kind of a select. Each of the values that we want in the drop down is given using an option tag. Okay, these are option tags or subtags within the select tag. Okay, So that is how the first drop down is given. That is line number 34. Now line number 42 on the left hand side is talking about a slightly differently showing select drop down. This is not showing up as a drop down. This is called multi select. Here we can actually select more than one item. For example, if the question is what languages can we speak, we should allow user to select more than one. Maybe somebody can speak Sanskrit and English, or English and Hindi, or maybe something else, right? So it is not a single one. So to select multiple items, there is a attribute called multiple that is clearly given out in line number 43. Okay, if we specify this attribute, notice it doesn't have a value for it. It is just a independent attribute by itself. If ever we specify this multiple attribute, then the browser will allow more than one element to be selected from the displayed options. Then there is a size is equal to 3. What does this mean? It means even though we have, if you see, there are 4 options that are encoded in HTML, what user is seeing only 3 with a scroll bar on the right hand side. So user can see 4th by scrolling down, right? That user can see 3 is coming out from the size that is there as a size attribute. Size is equal to 3 is indicating that we want user to see only 3 at any point in time. Why is this required? Because otherwise the screen may look ugly with a lot of options being shown. Okay, so that is about select. Notice that some of these attributes may not be supported uniformly across all browsers. This is a complete example now that we have for the form that has been discussed earlier. You can go through this leisurely, looking at each line of the screen, but for most of whatever we have discussed, this is already they are already discussed, and couple of them are not discussed. Let's look at them. The label tag on line number 7 is new, but we have discussed this. Label for fname. Fname is the name for the input for which this label is meant for. That is the label. Okay, that is one. And then we have not discussed about additional feedback item, which is a text box. Again, the text area, and the text area also has a name, and there are 2 attributes, rows and columns. We are saying the text box should be displayed with with 4 rows to start with and 50 columns. Each column assume is one letter. So we are saying there should be 4 rows in the text box text area display. Each row should be able to hold 50 characters or 50 letters. That is the text area. Okay. The last thing that we haven't talked about is a field set. The field set is essentially a grouping. See the rectangle around the form, that is the field set, and we said that we want a legend, personal details, that is displayed on the top of the rectangle. Okay, this is a complete example that you should go through in leisure and understand it fully. Now the form tag we haven't discussed. The line number 4 has a form tag that is ending on line number 50. In this example, no attributes have been mentioned at all. But then form tag has some attributes. Some of these are important. The first attribute is called action, and it is expecting a URL as a value. What does this URL mean? It is the URL to which the data is sent when the form is submitted. Look at the example. You say action is equal to, and then there is a URL. When the form is submitted, all the data from the form is sent back to this URL using the HTML method that is given out by the method attribute. It can be get or it can be post. Then there is an autocomplete attribute. It can be on or off. It is a hint to the browser whether you want any automatic filling of the forms or not. And then there is a name attribute, which is essentially the text, which is a text, which is essentially a set of letters that specifies the name of the form. And then there is a target attribute that indicates where the result should be displayed. What is the result here? Remember, we are submitting a form, so the server is expected to process the data and send back the response, right? Imagine you are searching for a particular name in some server. The server will say, I have these many results, right? So the results will be in HTML. Whether it should be displayed in the same window or in a separate tab or in a separate window is determined by the target attribute. We have already discussed different attributes for this kind of thing. When a new window or new tab or blank, those things, the same values are applicable here as well. Then the other important thing that we have seen so far is the input tag. We have also seen some individual attributes for input tags, right? Now let's look at some more. There is a checked attribute. This can be yes or no, whether the checkbox or the radio button should be pre-selected when the page is loading. This attribute is applicable only for checkboxes and radios. Disabled means that we show that field, but we don't allow the user to change anything over there. But disabled will also not be sent back to the server when the form is submitted. Max and min, we have already seen the maximum value and the minimum value for a numbered text field. Max length also is something that we have seen, the number of characters for the input field that user can enter. Read only is a field that user is not allowed to modify, but it can be sent back to the server. Required is a mandatory field. User cannot skip filling that value in that field. Size is something that we have seen already. It is the size of the input field in terms of the number of characters. This is essentially only for the display purposes. If we say size is 10 and if user enters a 15 character string, user can enter 15 character string, but it will be scrolling inside the text field. Value is the value to be put, the default value of the input field. That's all about the forms lesson today. I hope you enjoy the lesson. The forms are very important part of interactivity as far as the HTML goes. We have barely skimmed through the surface of what HTML can do in terms of forms. But I hope you got the basics right to go ahead and then do some more reading and then get more understanding or a bit more thorough understanding of the forms. Thank you.